Chapter 66. I am invited to the villa of a Spanish don, where we went with an English gentleman, and make a very interesting discovery. We leave Buenos Aires, and arrive at Jamaica, our ship being freed from the disagreeable lading of Negroes, to whom, indeed, I had been a miserable slave since our leaving the coast of Guinea. I began to enjoy myself, and breathe with pleasure the pure air of Paraguay, this part of which is reckoned the Montpellier of South America, and has obtained, on account of its climate, the name of Buenos Aires. It was in this delicious place that I gave myself entirely up to the thoughts of my dear Narcissa, whose image still kept possession of my breast, and whose charms, enhanced by absence, appeared to my imagination, if possible, more engaging than ever. I calculated the profits of my voyage, which even exceeded my expectation, resolved to purchase sinecure upon my arrival in England, and if I should find the squire as averse to me as ever, marry his sister by stealth, and in case our family should increase, rely on the generosity of my uncle, who was by this time worth a considerable sum. While I amused myself with these agreeable projects, and the transporting thoughts of enjoying Narcissa, we were very much caressed by the Spanish gentlemen, who frequently formed parties of pleasure for our entertainment, in which we made excursions a good way into the country. Among those who signalized themselves by their civility to us, was one Don Antonio de Ribera, a very polite young gentleman, with whom I had contracted an intimate friendship, who invited us one day to his country house, and, as a further inducement to our compliance, promised to procure for us the company of an English senior, who had been settled in those parts many years and acquired the love and esteem of the whole province by his affability, good sense, and honorable behavior. We accepted his invitation, and set out for his villa, where we had not been longer than an hour, when the person arrived in whose favor I had been so much prepossessed. He was a tall man, remarkably well-shaped, of a fine mien and appearance, commanding respect, and seemed to be turned of 40. The features of his face were saddened with a reserve and gravity, which in other countries would have been thought the effect of melancholy, but here appeared to have been contracted by his commerce with the Spaniards, who are remarkable for that severity of countenance. Understanding from Don Antonio that we were his countrymen, he saluted us all round very complacently, and fixing his eyes attentively on me, uttered a deep sigh. I had been struck with a profound veneration for him at his first coming into the room, and no sooner observed this expression of his sorrow, directed, as it were, in a particular manner to me, that my heart took part in his grief. I sympathized involuntarily and sighed in my turn. Having asked leave of our entertainer, he accosted us in English, professed his satisfaction at seeing so many of his countrymen in such a remote place, and asked the captain, who went by the name of Signor Thomas, from what part of Britain he had sailed and whither he was bound. My uncle told him that we had sailed from the river Thames, and were bound for the same plain by the way of Jamaica, where we intended to take in a lading of sugar. Having satisfied himself in these and other particulars about the state of the war, he gave us to understand that he had a longing desire to revisit his native country, in consequence of which he had already transmitted to Europe the greatest part of his fortune in neutral bottoms, and would willingly embark the rest of it with himself in our ship, provided the captain had no objection to such a passenger. My uncle very prudently replied, that for his part he should be glad of his company, if he could procure the consent of the governor, without which he durst not take him on board, whatever inclination he had to oblige him. The gentleman approved of his discretion, and telling him that there would be no difficulty in obtaining the connivance of the governor, who was his good friend, shifted the conversation to another subject. I was overjoyed to hear his intention, and already interested myself so much in his favor that, had he been disappointed, I should have been very unhappy. In the course of our entertainment, he eyed me with uncommon attachment. I felt a surprising attraction towards him. When he spoke, I listened with attention and reverence. The dignity of his deportment filled me with affection and awe, and, in short, the emotions of my soul, in presence of this stranger, were strong and unaccountable. Having spent the best part of the day with us, he took his leave, telling Captain Thomas that he should hear from him in a short time. He was no sooner gone than I asked 1,000 questions about him of Don Antonio, who could give me no other satisfaction than that his name was Don Rodrigo, that he had lived 15 or 16 years in these parts, was reputed rich, and supposed to have been unfortunate in his younger years, because he was observed to nourish a pensive melancholy, even from the time of his first settlement among them, but that nobody had ventured to inquire into the cause of his sorrow, in consideration of his peace, which might suffer in the recapitulation of his misfortunes. I was seized with an irresistible desire of knowing the particulars of his fate, and enjoyed not an hour of repose during the whole night, by reason of the eager conceptions that inspired me with regard to his story, which I resolved, if possible, to learn. Next morning, while we were at breakfast, 3 mules, richly caparisoned, arrived with a message from Don Rodrigo, desiring our company, and that of Don Antonio, at his house, which was situated about 10 miles further up in the country. I was pleased with this invitation, in consequence of which we mounted the mules which he had provided for us, and alighted at his house before noon. Here we were splendidly entertained by the generous stranger, who still seemed to show a particular regard for me, and after dinner made me a present of a ring, set with a beautiful amethyst, the production of that country, saying, at the same time, that he was once blessed with a son, who, had he lived, would have been nearly of my age. This observation, delivered with a profound sigh, made my heart throb with violence. A crowd of confused ideas rushed upon my imagination, which, while I endeavored to unravel, my uncle perceived my absence of thought, and tapping me on the shoulder, said, "Buons, are you asleep, Rory?" Before I had time to reply, Don Rodrigo, with uncommon eagerness of voice and look, pronounced, "Pray, Captain, what is the young gentleman's name?" "His name," said my uncle, "is Roderick Random." "Gracious powers," cried the stranger, starting up, "and his mother's?" "His mother," answered the captain, amazed, "was called Charlotte Bowling." "Oh bounteous heaven," exclaimed Don Rodrigo, springing across the table, and clasping me in his arms, "my son! My son! Have I found thee again? Do I hold thee in my embrace, after having lost and despaired of seeing thee so long?" So saying, he fell upon my neck, and wept aloud with joy, while the power of nature operating strongly in my breast. I was lost in rapture, and while he pressed me to his heart, let fall a shower of tears in his bosom. His utterance was choked up a good while by the agitation of his soul. At length he broke out into mysterious providence. "Oh my dear Charlotte, there yet remains a pledge of our love. And such a pledge, so found. O infinite goodness, let me adore thy all-wise decrees." Having thus expressed himself, he kneeled upon the floor, lifted up his eyes and hands to heaven, and remained some minutes in silent ecstasy of devotion. I put myself in the same posture, adored the all-good dispenser in a prayer of mental thanksgiving, and when his ejaculation was ended, did homage to my father, and craved his paternal blessing. He hugged me again with unutterable fondness, and having implored the protection of heaven upon my head, raised me from the ground, and presented me as his son to the company, who wept in concert over this affecting scene. Among the rest, my uncle did not fail to discover the goodness and joy of his heart. Albeit unused to the melting mood, he blubbered with great tenderness, and wringing my father's hand, cried, "Brother Random, I'm rejoiced to see you, God be praised for this happy meeting." Don Rodrigo, understanding that he was his brother-in-law, embraced him affectionately, saying, "Are you my Charlotte's brother?" "Alas! Unhappy Charlotte! But why should I repine? We shall meet again, never more to part. Brother, you are truly welcome. Dear son, I am transported with unspeakable joy. This day is a jubilee, my friends and servants shall share my satisfaction." While he dispatched messengers to the gentlemen in the neighborhood, to announce this event, and gave orders for a grand entertainment, I was so much affected with the tumults of passion, which assailed me on this great, sudden, and unexpected occasion, that I fell sick, fevered, and in less than 3 hours became quite delirious, so that the preparations were countermanded, and the joy of the family converted into grief and despair. Physicians were instantly called. I was plentifully blooded in the foot, my lower extremities were bathed in a decoction of salutiferous herbs. In 10 hours after I was taken ill I enjoyed a critical sweat, and next day felt the remains of the distemper, but an agreeable lassitude, which did not hinder me from getting up. During the progress of this fever, which, from the term or its duration, is called ephemera, my father never once quitted my bedside, but administered the prescriptions of the physicians with the most pious care, while Captain Bowling manifested his concern by the like attendance. I no sooner found myself delivered from this disease, than I bethought myself of my honest friend Strap, and resolving to make him happy forthwith in the knowledge of my good fortune, told my father in general, that I had been infinitely obliged to this faithful adherent, and begged he would indulge me so far as to send for him, without letting him know my happiness, until he could receive an account of it from my own mouth. My request was instantly complied with, and a messenger with a spare mule dispatched to the ship, carrying orders from the captain to the mate, to send the steward by the bearer. My health being, in the meantime, re-established, and my mind composed, I began to relish this important turn of my fortune, in reflecting upon the advantages with which it must be attended, and, as the idea of my lovely Narcissa always joined itself to every scene of happiness I could imagine, I entertained myself now with the prospect of possessing her in that distinguished sphere to which she was entitled by her birth and qualifications. Having often mentioned her name while I was deprived of my senses, my father guessed that there was an intimate connection between us, and discovering the picture which hung in my bosom by ribbon, did not doubt that it was the resemblance of my amiable mistress. In this belief he was confirmed by my uncle, who told him that it was the picture of a young woman, to whom I was under promise of marriage. Alarmed at this piece of information, Don Rodrigo took the first opportunity of questioning me about the particulars of this affair, which when I had candidly recounted, he approved of my passion, and promised to contribute all in his power towards its success. Though I never doubted his generosity, I was transported on this occasion, and throwing myself at his feet, told him, he had now completed my happiness, for, without the possession of Narcissa I should be miserable among all the pleasures of life. He raised me with a smile of paternal fondness, said he knew what it was to be in love, and observed that, if he had been as tenderly beloved by his father as I was by mine, he should not now perhaps have cause. Here he was interrupted by a sigh, the tear rushed into his eye, suppressed the dictates of his grief, and the time being opportune, desired me to relate the passages of my life, which my uncle had told him were manifold and surprising. I recounted the most material circumstances of my fortune, to which he listened with wonder and attention, manifesting from time to time the different emotions which my different situations may be supposed to have raised in a parent's breast, and, when my detail was ended, blessed God for the adversity I had undergone, which, he said, enlarged the understanding, improved the heart, steeled the constitution, and qualified a young man for all the duties and enjoyments of life much better than any education which affluence could bestow. When I had thus satisfied his curiosity, I discovered an inclination to hear the particulars of his story, which he gratified by beginning with his marriage, and proceeded to the day of his disappearing, as I have related in the first part of my memoirs. Careless of life, continued he, and unable to live in a place where every object recalled the memory of my dear Charlotte, whom I had lost through the barbarity of an unnatural parent, I took my leave of you, my child, then an infant, with a heart full of unutterable woe, but little suspecting that my father's unkindness would have descended to my innocent orphan, and setting out alone at midnight for the nearest seaport, early next morning got on board a ship, bound, as I had heard, for France, and, bargaining with the master for my passage, bade a long adieu to my native country, and put to sea with the first fair wind. The place of our destination was Granville, but we had the misfortune to run upon a ridge of rocks near the island of Alderney, called the Casquets, where the sea running high, the ship went to pieces, the boat sunk alongside, and every soul on board perished, except myself, who, by the assistance of a grating got ashore on the coast of Normandy. I went directly to Cannes, where I was so lucky as to meet with a count, whom I had formerly known in my travels. With this gentleman I set out for Paris, where I was recommended by him and other friends, as tutor to a young nobleman, whom I accompanied to the court of Spain. There we remained a whole year, at the end of which my pupil being recalled by his father, I quitted my office, and stayed behind, by the advice of a certain Spanish grandee, who took me into his protection, and introduced me to another nobleman, who was afterwards created Viceroy of Peru. He insisted on my attending him to his government of the Indies, where, however, by reason of my religion, it was not in his power to make my fortune any other way than by encouraging me to trade, which I had not long prosecuted when my patron died, and I found myself in the midst of strangers, without one friend to support or protect me. Urged by this consideration, I sold my effects, and removed to this country, the governor of which, having been appointed by the viceroy, was my intimate acquaintance. Here has heaven prospered my endeavors, during a residence of 16 years, in which my tranquillity was never invaded but by the remembrance of your mother, whose death I have in secret mourned without ceasing, and the reflection of you, whose fate I could never learn notwithstanding all my inquiries by means of my friends in France, who, after the most strict examination, could give me no other account than that you went abroad 6 years ago, and was never after heard of. I could not rest satisfied with this imperfect information, and, though my hope of finding you was but languid, resolved to go in quest of you in person, for which purpose, I have remitted to Holland the value of £20,000, and am in possession of 15,000 more, with which I intended to embark myself on board of Captain Bowling, before I discovered this amazing stroke of Providence, which, you may be sure, has not altered my intention. My father, having entertained us with this agreeable sketch of his life, withdrew, in order to relieve Don Antonio, who, in his absence, had done the honors of his house, and I was just dressed for my appearance among the guests, when Strap arrived from the ship. He no sooner entered the grand apartment in which I was, and saw the magnificence of my apparel, than his speech was lost in amazement, and he gaped in silence at the objects that surrounded him. I took him by the hand, observed that I had sent for him to be a witness and sharer of my happiness, and told him I had found a father. At these words he started, and, after having continued some minutes with his mouth and eyes wide open, cried, "Ah, odd, I know what. Go thy ways, poor Narcissa, and go thy ways somebody else. Well, Lord, what a thing is love. God help us. Are all our mad pranks and protestations come to this? And have you fixed your habitation in this distant land? God prosper you. I find we must part at last, for I would not leave my poor carcass so far from my native home, for all the wealth of the universe." With these ejaculations, he began to sob and make wry faces, upon which I assured him of his mistake, both in regard to my staying in Paraguay, and informed him, as briefly as I could, of the great event that had happened. Never was rapture more ludicrously expressed than in the behavior of this worthy creature, who cried, laughed, whistled, sung, and danced, all in a breath. His transport was scarce over, when my father entered, who no sooner understood that this was Strap, than he took him by the hand, saying, "Is this the honest man who befriended you so much in your distress? You are welcome to my house, and I will soon put it in the power of my son to reward you for your good offices in his behalf. In the meantime go with us and partake of the repast that is provided." Strap, wild as he was with joy, would by no means accept of the proffered honor, crying, "God forbid. I know my distance, your worship shall excuse me." And Don Rodrigo, finding his modesty invincible, recommended him to his majordomo, to be treated with the utmost respect, while he carried me in a large saloon, where I was presented to a numerous company, who loaded me with compliments and caresses, and congratulated my father in terms not proper for me to repeat. Without specifying the particulars of our entertainment, let it suffice to say, it was at the same time elegant and sumptuous, and the rejoicings lasted 2 days, after which, Don Rodrigo settled his affairs, converted his effects into silver and gold, visited and took leave of all his friends, who were grieved at his departure, and honored me with considerable presents, and, coming on board of my uncle's ship, with the first fair wind we sailed from the Rio de la Plata, and in 2 months came safe to an anchor in the harbor of Kingston, in the island of Jamaica. Chapter 67. I visit my old friend Thompson. We set sail for Europe, meet with an odd adventure, arrive in England, I ride across the country from Portsmouth to Sussex, converse with Mrs. Sagely, who informs me of Narcissa's being in London. In consequence of this intelligence, I proceed to Canterbury, meet with my old friend Morgan, arrive in London, visit Narcissa, introduce my father to B. He is charmed with her good sense and beauty, we come to a determination of demanding her brother's consent to our marriage. I inquired, as soon as I got ashore, about my generous companion, Mr. Thompson, and hearing that he lived in a flourishing condition upon the estate left him by his wife's father, who had been dead some years, I took horse immediately, with the consent of Don Rodrigo, who had heard me mention him with great regard, and in a few hours reached the place of his habitation. I should much wrong the delicacy of Mr. Thompson's sentiments to say barely he was glad to see me. He felt all that the most sensible and disinterested friendship could feel on this occasion, introduced me to his wife, a very amiable young lady, who had already blessed him with 2 fine children, and being as yet ignorant of my circumstances, frankly offered me the assistance of his purse and interest. I thanked him for his generous intention, and made him acquainted with my situation, on which he congratulated me with great joy, and, after I had stayed with him a whole day and night, accompanied me back to Kingston, to wait upon my father, whom he invited to his house. Don Rodrigo complied with his request, and, having been handsomely entertained during the space of a week, returned extremely well satisfied with the behavior of my friend and his lady, to whom, at parting, he presented a very valuable diamond ring, as a token of his esteem. During the course of my conversation with Mr. Thompson, he gave me to understand that his old commander Captain Oakham was dead some months, and that, immediately after his death, a discovery had been made of some valuable effects that he had feloniously secreted out of a prize by the assistance of Dr. Mackshane, who was now actually in prison on that account, and, being destitute of friends, subsisted solely on the charity of my friend, whose bounty he had implored in the most abject manner. After having been the barbarous occasion of driving him to that terrible extremity on board of the Thunder, which we have formerly related. Whatsoever this wretch had been guilty of, I applauded Mr. Thompson's generosity towards him in his distress, which wrought so much upon me also, that I sent him 10 pistoles, in such a private manner that he could never know his benefactor. While my father and I were caressed among the gentlemen on shore, Captain Bowling had written to his owners, by the packet, which sailed a few days after our arrival, signifying his prosperous voyage hitherto, and desiring them to insure his ship and cargo homeward bound, after which precaution he applied himself so heartily to the task of loading his ship that, with the assistance of Mr. Thompson, she was full in less than 6 weeks. This kind gentleman likewise procured for Don Rodrigo bills upon London for the greatest part of his gold and silver, by which means it was secured against the risk of the seas and the enemy, and, before we sailed, supplied us with such large quantities of all kinds of stock, that not only we, but the ship's company, fared sumptuously during the voyage. Everything being ready, we took our leave of our kind entertainers, and, going on board at Port Royal, set sail for England on the 1st day of June. We beat up to windward, with fine easy weather, and one night believing ourselves near Cape Tiburon, lay to, with an intention to wood and water next morning in the bay. While we remained in this situation, a sailor, having drunk more new rum than he could carry, staggered overboard, and, notwithstanding all the means that could be used to preserve him, went to the bottom, and disappeared. About 2 hours after this melancholy accident happened, as I enjoyed the cool air on the quarter-deck, I heard a voice rising, as it were, out of the sea and calling, "Ho, the ship ahoy!" Upon which one of the men upon the forecastle cried, "I'll be D.N.D. if that ain't Jack Marlinspike," who went overboard. Not a little surprised at this event, I jumped into the boat that lay alongside, with the second mate and 4 men, and rowing towards the place from whence the voice, which repeated the hail, seemed to proceed, we perceived something floating upon the water. When we had rowed a little further, we discerned it to be a man riding upon a hencoop. Seeing us approach, pronounced with a hoarse voice, "D.N. your bloods. Why did you not answer when I hailed?" Our mate, who was a veritable seaman, hearing his salute, said, "By G, my lads, this is none of our man. This is the devil, pull away for the ship." The fellows obeyed his command without question, and were already some fathoms on our return, when I insisted on their taking up the poor creature, and prevailed upon them to go back to the wreck, which when we came near the second time, and signified our intention, we received an answer of, "Avast, avast. What ship, brother?" Being satisfied in this particular, he cried, "D.N. And the ship, I was in hopes it had been my own. Where are you bound? We satisfied his curiosity in this particular too, upon which he suffered himself to be taken on board, and, after having been comforted with a dram, told us, he belonged to the Vesuvio man-of-war, upon a cruise off the island of Hispaniola, that he had fallen overboard 24 hours ago, and the ship being under sail, they did not choose to bring to, but tossed a hencoop overboard for his convenience, upon which he was in good hopes of reaching the Cape next morning. Howsomever, he was as well content to be aboard of us because he did not doubt that we should meet his ship, and if he had gone ashore in the bay, he might have been taken prisoner by the French. My uncle and father were very much diverted with the account of this fellow's unconcerned behavior, and in 2 days, meeting with the Vesuvio, as he expected, sent him on board of her, according to his desire. Having beat up successfully the windward passage, we stretched to the northward, and falling in with a westerly wind, in 8 weeks arrived in the soundings, and in 2 days after made for the Lizard. It is impossible to express the joy I felt at the sight of English ground. Don Rodrigo was not unmoved, and Strap shed tears of gladness. The sailors profited by our satisfaction, the shoe that was nailed to the mast being quite filled with our liberality. My uncle resolved to run up into the Downs at once, but the wind shifting when we were abreast of the Isle of Wight, he was obliged to turn into St. Helens, and come to Spithead, to the great mortification of the crew, 30 of whom were immediately pressed on board a man-of-war. My father and I went ashore immediately at Portsmouth, leaving Strap with the captain to go round with the ship and take care of our effects, and I discovered so much impatience to see my charming Narcissa, that my father permitted me to ride across the country to her brother's house, while he should hire a post-chaise for London, where he would wait for me at a place to which I directed him. Fired with all the eagerness of passion, I took post that very night, and in the morning reached an inn about 3 miles from the squire's habitation. Here I remained till next morning, allaying the torture of my impatience with the rapturous hope of seeing that divine creature after an absence of 18 months, which, far from impairing, had raised my love to the most exalted pitch. Neither were my reflections free from apprehensions, that something intervened in spite of all my hope, and represented her as having yielded to the importunity of her brother and blessed the arms of a happy rival. My thoughts were even maddened with the fear of her death, and, when I arrived in the dark at the house of Mrs. Sagely, I had not for some time courage to desire admittance, lest my soul should be shocked with dismal tidings. At length, however, I knocked, and no sooner certified the good gentlewoman of my voice than she opened the door, and received me with the most affectionate embrace, that brought tears into her aged eyes. For heaven's sake, dear mother, cried I, tell me how is Narcissa? Is she the same that I left her? She blessed my ears with saying, she is as beautiful, in as good health, and as much yours as ever. Transported at this assurance, I begged to know if I could not see her that very night, when this sage matron gave me to understand that my mistress was in London, and that things were strangely altered in the squire's house since my departure, that he had been married a whole year to Melinda, who at first found means to wean his attention so much from Narcissa, that he became quite careless of that lovely sister, comforting himself with the clause in his father's will, by which she should forfeit her fortune, by marrying without his consent, that my mistress, being but indifferently treated by her sister-in-law, had made use of her freedom some months ago, and gone to town, where she was lodged with Miss Williams, in expectation of my arrival, and had been pestered with the addresses of Lord Quiverwit, who, finding her heart engaged, had fallen upon a great many shifts to persuade her that I was dead, but, finding all his artifices unsuccessful, and despairing of gaining her affection, he had consoled himself for her indifference, by marrying another lady some weeks ago, who had already left him on account of some family uneasiness. Besides this interesting information, she told me there was not a great deal of harmony between Melinda and the squire, who was so much disgusted at the number of gallants who continued to hover about her even after her marriage, that he had hurried her down into the country, much against her own inclination, where their mutual animosities had risen to such a height, that they preserved no decency before company or servants, but abused one another in the grossest terms. This good old gentlewoman, to give me a convincing proof of my dear Narcissa's unalterable love, gratified me with a sight of the last letter she had favored her with, in which I was mentioned with so much honor, tenderness, and concern, that my soul was fired with impatience, and I determined to ride all night, that I might have it the sooner in my power to make her happy. Mrs. Sagely, perceiving my eagerness, and her maternal affection being equally divided between Narcissa and me, begged leave to remind me of the sentiments with which I went abroad, that would not permit me for any selfish gratification to prejudice the fortune of that amiable young lady, who must entirely depend upon me, after having bestowed herself in marriage. I thanked her for her kind concern, and as briefly as possible described my flourishing situation, which afforded this humane person infinite wonder and satisfaction. I told her, that now I had an opportunity to manifest my gratitude for the many obligations I owed, I would endeavor to make her old age comfortable and easy, as a step to which I proposed she should come and live with Narcissa and me. This venerable gentlewoman was so much affected with my words, that the tears ran down her ancient cheeks. She thanked heaven that I had not belied the presages she had made, on her first acquaintance with me, acknowledging my generosity, as she called it, in the most elegant and pathetic expressions, but declined my proposal, on account of her attachment to the dear melancholy cottage where she had so peacefully consumed her solitary widowhood. Finding her immovable on this subject, I insisted on her accepting a present of 30 guineas, and took my leave, resolving to accommodate her with the same sum annually, for the more comfortable support of the infirmities of old age. Having rode all night, I found myself at Canterbury in the morning, where I alighted to procure fresh horses, and, as I walked into the inn, perceived an apothecary's on the other side of the street, with the name of Morgan over the door. Alarmed at this discovery, I could not help thinking that my old messmate had settled in this place, and upon inquiry found my conjecture true, and that he was married lately to a widow in that city, by whom he had got £3,000. Rejoiced at this intelligence, I went to his shop as soon as it was open, and found my friend behind the counter, busy in preparing a clyster. I saluted him at entrance, with, "Your servant, Mr. Morgan." Upon which he looked at me, and replying, "Your most humble servant, good sir," rubbed his ingredients in the mortar without any emotion. "What," said I, "Morgan, have you forgot your old messmate?" At these words he looked up again, and starting, cried, "As caught is my, sure it cannot, yes, by my salvation, I believe it is my dear friend Mr. Rantom." He was no sooner convinced of my identity, than he threw down the pestle, overset the mortar, and jumping over the board, swept up the contents with his clothes, flew about my neck, hugged me affectionately, and daubed me all over with turpentine and the yolks of eggs which he had been mixing when I came in. Our mutual congratulations being over, he told me, that he found himself a widower upon his return from the West Indies, that he had got interest to be appointed surgeon of a man-of-war, in which capacity he had served some years, until he married an apothecary's widow, with whom he now enjoyed a pretty good sum of money, peace, and quiet, and an indifferent good trade. He was very desirous of hearing my adventures, which I assured him I had not time to relate, but told him in general, my circumstances were very good, and that I hoped to see him when I should not be in such a hurry as at present. He insisted, however, on my staying breakfast, and introduced me to his wife, who seemed to be a decent sensible woman, pretty well stricken in years. In the course of our conversation, he showed the sleeve buttons I had exchanged with him at our parting in the West Indies, and was not a little proud to see that I had preserved his with the same care. When I informed him of Macshane's condition, he seemed at first to exult over his distress, but, after a little recollection, said, "Well, he has paid for his malice, I forgive him, and may God forgive him likewise." He expressed great concern for the soul of Captain Oakham, which he believed was now gnashing its teeth, but it was some time before I could convince him of Thompson's being alive, at whose good fortune, nevertheless, he was extremely glad. Having renewed our protestations of friendship, I bade the honest Welshman and his spouse farewell, and, taking post-horses, arrived at London that same night, where I found my father in good health, to whom I imparted what I had learned of Narcissa. This indulgent parent approved of my intention of marrying her, even without fortune, provided her brother's consent could not be obtained, promised to make over to me in a few days a sufficiency to maintain her in a fashionable manner, and expressed a desire of seeing this amiable creature, who had captivated me so much. As I had not slept the night before, and was besides fatigued with my journey, I found myself under a necessity of taking some repose, and went to bed accordingly. Next morning, about 10 o'clock, took a chair, and according to Mrs. Sagely's directions, went to my charmer's lodgings, and inquired for Miss Williams. I had not waited in the parlor longer than a minute, when this young woman entered, and no sooner perceived me, than she shrieked and ran backward, but I got between her and the door, and clasping her in my arms, brought her to herself with an embrace. "Good heaven," cried she, "Mr. Random, is it you indeed? My mistress will run distracted with joy." I told her, it was from an apprehension that my sudden appearance might have had some bad effect on my dear Narcissa, that I had desired to see her first, in order to concert some method of acquainting her mistress gradually with my arrival. She approved of my conduct, and, after having yielded to the suggestions of her own friendship, in asking if my voyage had been successful, charged herself with that office, and left me glowing with desire of seeing and embracing the object of my love. In a very little time I heard somebody coming down the stairs in haste, and the voice of my angel pronounce, with an eager tone, "O heaven! Is it possible? Where is he?" How were my faculties aroused at this well-known sound! And how was my soul transported when she broke in upon my view in all the bloom of ripened beauty! Grace was in all her steps, heaven in her eye, in every gesture dignity and love. You, whose souls are susceptible of the most delicate impressions, whose tender bosoms have felt the affecting vicissitudes of love, who have suffered an absence of 18 long months from the dear object of your hope, and found at your return the melting fair as kind and constant as your heart can wish, do me justice on this occasion, and conceive what unutterable rapture possessed us both, while we flew into each other's arms. This was no time for speech. Locked in a mutual embrace, we continued some minutes in a silent trance of joy. When I thus encircled all my soul held dear, while I hung over her beauties, beheld her eyes sparkle, and every feature flush with virtuous fondness, when I saw her enchanting bosom heave with undissembled rapture, and knew myself the happy cause, heavens! What was my situation? I am tempted to commit my paper to the flames, and to renounce my pen for ever, because its most ardent and lucky expression so poorly describes the emotions of my soul. "O adorable Narcissa," cried I, "O miracle of beauty, love and truth! I at last fold thee in my arms. I at last can call thee mine. No jealous brother shall thwart our happiness again. Fortune hath at length recompensed me for all my sufferings, and enabled me to do justice to my love." The dear creature smiled ineffably charmingly, and, with a look of bewitching tenderness, said, "And shall we never part again?" "Never," I replied, "thou wondrous pattern of all earthly perfection. Never, until death shall divide us. By this ambrosial kiss, 1,000 times more fragrant than the breeze that sweeps the orange grove, I never more will leave thee." As my first transport abated, my passion grew turbulent and unruly. I was giddy with standing on the brink of bliss, and all my virtue and philosophy were scarce sufficient to restrain the inordinate sallies of desire. Narcissa perceived the conflict within me, and with her usual dignity of prudence, called off my imagination from the object in view, and with eager expressions of interested curiosity, desired to know the particulars of my voyage. In this I gratified her inclination, bringing my story down to the present hour. She was infinitely surprised at the circumstance of finding my father, which brought tears into her lovely eyes. She was transported at hearing that approved of my flame, discovered a longing desire of being introduced to him, congratulated herself and me upon my good fortune, and observed, that this great and unexpected stroke of fate seemed to have been brought about by the immediate direction of Providence. Having entertained ourselves some hours with the genuine effusions of our souls, I obtained her consent to complete my happiness as soon as my father should judge it proper, and, applying with my own hands a valuable necklace, composed of diamonds and amethysts set alternately, which an old Spanish lady at Paraguay had presented me with, I took my leave, promising to return in the afternoon with Don Rodrigo. When I went home, this generous parent inquired very affectionately about the health of my dear Narcissa, to whom, that I might be the more agreeable, he put into my hand a deed, by which I found myself in possession of £15,000, exclusive of the profits of my own merchandise, which amounted to 3,000 more. After dinner I accompanied him to the lodgings of my mistress, who, being dressed for the occasion, made a most dazzling appearance. I could perceive him struck with her figure, which I really think was the most beautiful that ever was created under the sun. He embraced her tenderly, and told her he was proud of having a son who had spirit to attempt, and qualifications to engage the affections of such a fine lady. She blushed at this compliment, and, with eyes full of the softest languishment turned upon me, said, she should have been unworthy of Mr. Random's attention, had she been blind to his extraordinary merit. I made no other answer than a low bow. My father, sighing, pronounced, such was once my Charlotte, while the tear rushed into his eye, and the tender heart of Narcissa manifested itself in 2 precious drops of sympathy, which, but for his presence, I would have kissed away. Without repeating the particulars of our conversation, I shall only observe, that Don Rodrigo was as much charmed with her good sense as with her appearance, and she was no less pleased with his understanding and polite address. It was determined that he should write to the squire, signifying his approbation of my passion for his sister, and offering a settlement, which he should have no reason to reject, and that, if he should refuse the proposal, we would crown our mutual wishes without any further regard to his will. Chapter 68. My father makes a present to Narcissa, the letter is dispatched to her brother, I appear among my acquaintance, Banter's behavior, the squire refuses his consent, my uncle comes to town, approves of my choice, I am married, we meet the squire and his lady at the play, our acquaintance is courted. After having spent the evening to the satisfaction of all present, my father addressed himself thus to Narcissa. Madam, give me leave to consider you hereafter as my daughter, in which capacity I insist upon your accepting this first instance of my paternal duty and affection. With these words he put into her hand a bank note of £500, which she no sooner examined, than with a low courtesy she replied. Dear sir, though I have not the least occasion for this supply, I have too great a veneration for you to refuse this proof of your generosity and esteem, which I the more freely receive, because I already look upon Mr. Random's interest as inseparably connected with mine. He was extremely well pleased with her frank and ingenuous reply, upon which we saluted, and wished her good night. The letter, at my request, was dispatched to Sussex by an express, and in the meantime, Don Rodrigo, to grace my nuptials, hired a ready-furnished house, and set up a very handsome equipage. Though I passed the greatest part of the day with the darling of my soul, I found leisure sometimes to be among my former acquaintance, who were astonished at the magnificence of my appearance. Banter in particular was confounded at the vicissitudes of my fortune, the causes of which he endeavored in vain to discover, until I thought fit to disclose the whole secret of my last voyage, partly in consideration of our former intimacy, and partly to prevent unfavorable conjectures, which he and others, in all probability, would have made in regard to my circumstances. He professed great satisfaction at this piece of news, and I had no cause to believe him insincere, when I considered that he would now look upon himself as acquitted of the debt he owed me, and at the same time flatter himself with the hopes of borrowing more. I carried him home to dinner with me, and my father liked his conversation so much, that, upon hearing his difficulties, he desired me to accommodate him for the present, and inquire, if he would accept of a commission in the army, towards the purchase of which he should willingly lend him money. Accordingly, I gave my friend an opportunity of being alone with me, when, as I expected, he told me that he was just on the point of being reconciled to an old rich uncle, whose heir he was, but wanted a few pieces for immediate expense, which he desired I would lend him and take my bond for the whole. His demand was limited to 10 guineas, and when I put 20 in his hand, he stared at me for some moments, then, putting it into his purse, 'Tis all one, you shall have the whole in a very short time. When I had taken his note, to save the expense of a bond, I expressed some surprise that a fellow of his spirit should loiter away his time in idleness, and, asked why he did not choose to make his fortune in the army. "What," said he, "throw away money upon a subaltern's commission, and be under the command of a parcel of scoundrels, who have raised themselves above me by the most infamous practices? No, I love independency too well to sacrifice my life, health, and pleasure, for such a pitiful consideration." Finding him adverse to this way of life, I changed the subject, and returned to Don Rodrigo, who had just received the following epistle from the squire: "Sir, concerning a letter which I received, subscribed random, this is the answer. As for you, I know nothing of you. Your son, or pretended son, I have seen. If he marries my sister, at his peril be it, I do declare that he shall not have 1 farthing of her fortune, which becomes my property, if she takes a husband without my consent. Your settlement, I do believe, is all a sham, and yourself no better than you should be, but if you had all the wealth of the Indies, your son shall never match in our family with the consent of." Orson Topol. My father was not much surprised at this polite letter, after having heard the character of the author, and as for me, I was even pleased at his refusal, because I had now an opportunity of showing my disinterested love. By his permission I waited on my charmer, and having imparted the contents of her brother's letter, at which she wept bitterly, in spite of all my consolation and caresses, the time of our marriage was fixed 2 days. During this interval, in which my soul was wound up to the last stretch of rapturous expectation, Narcissa endeavored to reconcile some of her relations in town to her marriage with me, but, finding them all deaf to her remonstrances, either out of envy or prejudice, she told me with the most enchanting sweetness, while the tears bedewed her lovely cheeks, "Sure the world will no longer question your generosity when you take a poor forlorn beggar to your arms." Affected with her sorrow, I pressed the fair mourner to my breast, and swore that she was more dear and welcome on that account, because she had sacrificed her friends and fortune to her love for me. My uncle, for whose character she had a great veneration, being by this time come to town, I introduced him to my bride, and, although he was not very much subject to refined sensations, he was struck dumb with admiration at her beauty. After having kissed and gazed at her for some time, he turned to me, saying, "Odds bobs, Rory! A notable prize indeed, finely built and gloriously rigged, I faith. If she ain't well manned when you take the command of her, sirrah, you deserve to go to sea in a cockle shell. No offence, I hope, niece. You must not mind what I say, being, as the saying is, a plain seafaring man, though mayhap I have as much regard for you as another." She received him with great civility, told him she had longed a great while to see a person to whom she was so much indebted for his generosity to Mr. Random, that she looked upon him as her uncle, by which name she begged leave to call him for the future, and that she was very sure he could say nothing that would give her the least offence. The honest captain was transported at her courteous behavior, and insisted upon giving her away at the ceremony, swearing that he loved her as well as if she was his own child, and that he would give 2,000 guineas to the first fruit of our love, as soon as it would squeak. Everything being settled for the solemnization of our nuptials, which were to be performed privately at my father's house, the auspicious hour arrived, when Don Rodrigo and my uncle went in the coach to fetch the bride and Miss Williams, leaving me with a parson, Banter, and Strap, neither of whom had as yet seen my charming mistress. My faithful valet, who was on the rack of impatience to behold a lady of whom he had heard so much, no sooner understood that the coach was returned, than he placed himself at a window, to have a peep at her as she alighted, and, when he saw her, clapped his hands together, turned up the white of his eyes, and, with his mouth wide open, remained in a sort of ecstasy, which broke out into, "Oda cert. Qualis in Eurote repes, aut por yuga synthi exercit Diana choros." The doctor and Banter were surprised to hear my man speak Latin, but when my father led Narcissa into the room, the object of their admiration was soon changed, as appeared in the countenances of both. Indeed, they must have been the most insensible of all beings, could they have beheld without emotion the divine creature that approached. She was dressed in a sack of white satin, embroidered on the breast with gold, the crown of her head was covered with a small French cap, from whence descended her beautiful hair in ringlets that waved upon her snowy neck, which dignified the necklace I had given her. Her looks glowed with modesty and love, and her bosom, through the veil of gauze that shaded it, afforded a prospect of Elysium. I received this inestimable gift of Providence as became me, and in a little time the clergyman did his office, my uncle, at his own earnest request, acting the part of a father to my dear Narcissa, who trembled very much, and had scarce spirit sufficient to support her under this great change of situation. Soon as she was mine by the laws or heaven and earth, I printed a burning kiss upon her lips. My father embraced her tenderly, my uncle hugged her with great affection, and I presented her to my friend Banter, who saluted her in a very polite manner. Miss Williams hung round her neck, and went plentifully, while Strap fell upon his knees, and begged to kiss his lady's hand, which she presented with great affability. I shall not pretend to describe my own feelings at this juncture. Let it suffice to say that having supped and entertained ourselves till 10 o'clock, I cautioned my Narcissa against exposing her health by sitting up too late, and she was prevailed upon to withdraw with her maid to an apartment destined for us. When she left the room, her face overspread with a blush that set all my blood in a state of fermentation, and made every pulse beat with tenfold vigor. She was so cruel as to let me remain in this condition a full half-hour, when, no longer able to restrain my impatience, I broke from the company, burst into her chamber, pushed out her confidante, and locked the door, and found her, O heaven and earth, a feast 1,000 times more delicious than my most sanguine hopes presaged. But, let me not profane the chaste mysteries of Hymen. I was the happiest of men. In the morning I was awaked by 3 or 4 drums, which Banter had placed under the window, upon which I withdrew the curtain, and enjoyed the unspeakable satisfaction of contemplating those angelic charms which were now in my possession. Beauty, which, whether sleeping or awake, shot forth peculiar graces. The light darting upon my Narcissa's eyes, she awoke also, and recollecting her situation, hid her blushes in my bosom. I was distracted with joy. I could not believe the evidence of my senses, and looked upon all that had happened as the fictions of a dream. In the meantime my uncle knocked at the door, and bade me turn out, for I had had a long spell. I rose accordingly, and sent Miss Williams to her mistress, myself receiving the congratulation of Captain Bowling, who rallied me in his sea phrase with great success. In less than an hour, Don Rodrigo led my wife into breakfast, where she received the compliments of the company on her looks, which, they said, if possible, were improved by matrimony. As her delicate ears were offended with none of those indecent ambiguities which are too often spoken on such occasions, she behaved with dignity, unaffected modesty, and ease, and, as a testimony of my affection and esteem, I presented her, in presence of them all, with a deed, by which I settled the whole fortune I was possessed of on her and her heirs for ever. She accepted it with a glance of most tender acknowledgment, observed, that she could not be surprised at anything of this kind I should do, and desired my father to take the trouble of keeping it, saying, next to my own Mr. Random, you are the person in whom I ought to have the greatest confidence. Charmed with her prudent and ingenuous manner of proceeding, he took the paper, and assured her that it should not lose its value while in his custody. As we had not many visits to give and receive, the little time we stayed in town was spent in going to public diversions, where I have the vanity to think Narcissa was seldom eclipsed. One night, in particular, we sent our footman to keep one of the stage boxes, which we no sooner entered, than we perceived in the opposite box the squire and his lady, who seemed not a little surprised at seeing us. I was pleased at this opportunity of confronting them, the more, because Melinda was robbed of all her admirers by my wife, who happened that night to outshine her sister both in beauty and dress. She was piqued at Narcissa's victory, tossed her head 1,000 different ways, flirted her fan, looked at us with disdain, then whispered to her husband, and broke out into an affected giggle, but all her arts proved ineffectual either to discompose Mrs. Random, or to conceal her own mortification, which at length forced her away long before the play was done. The news of our marriage being spread, with many circumstances to our disadvantage, by the industry of this malignant creature, a certain set of persons fond of scandal began to inquire into the particulars of my fortune, which they no sooner understood to be independent, than the tables were turned, and our acquaintance was courted as much as it had been despised before. But she had too much dignity of pride to encourage this change of conduct, especially in her relations, whom she could never be prevailed upon to see, after the malicious reports they had raised to her prejudice. Chapter 69. My father intends to revisit the place of his nativity. We propose to accompany him. My uncle renews his will in my favour, determining to go to sea again. We set out for Scotland, arrive at Edinburgh, purchase our paternal estate, proceed to it, halt at the town where I was educated, take up my bond to Crabbe, the behaviour of Potion and his wife, and one of our female cousins. Our reception at the estate, Strap marries Miss Williams, and is settled by my father to his own satisfaction. I am more and more happy. My father intending to revisit his native country, and pay the tribute of a few tears at my mother's grave, Narcissa and I resolved to accompany him in the execution of his pious office, and accordingly prepared for the journey, in which, however, my uncle would not engage, being resolved to try his fortune once more at sea. In the meantime he renewed his will in favour of my wife and me, and deposited it in the hands of his brother-in-law, while I, that I might not be wanting to my own interest, summoned the squire to produce his father's will at Doctors' Commons, and employed a proctor to manage the affair in my absence. Everything being thus settled, we took leave of all our friends in London, and set out for Scotland, Don Rodrigo, Narcissa, Miss Williams, and I, in the coach, and Strap, with 2 men in livery, on horseback. As we made easy stages, my charmer held it out very well, till we arrived at Edinburgh, where we proposed to rest ourselves some weeks. Here Don Rodrigo, having intelligence that the fox-hunter had spoilt his estate, which was to be exposed to sale by public auction, he determined to make a purchase of the spot where he was born, and actually bought all the land that belonged to his father. In a few days after this bargain was made, we left Edinburgh, in order to go and take possession, and by the way halted one night in that town where I was educated. Upon inquiry, I found that Mr. Crabbe was dead, whereupon I sent for his executor, paid the sum I owed with interest, and took up my bond. Mr. Potion and his wife, hearing of my arrival, had the assurance to come to the inn where we lodged, and send up their names, with the desire of being permitted to pay their respects to my father and me, but their sordid behaviour towards me, when I was an orphan, had made too deep an impression on my mind to be effaced by this mean mercenary piece of condescension. I therefore rejected their message with disdain, and bade Strap tell them, that my father and I desired to have no communication with such low-minded wretches as they were. They had not been gone half an hour, when a woman, without any ceremony, opened the door of the room where we sat, and, making towards my father, accosted him with, "Uncle, your servant, I am glad to see you." This was no other than one of my female cousins, mentioned in the first part of my memoirs, to whom Don Rodrigo replied, "Pray, who are you, madam?" "Oh," cried she, "my cousin Rory there knows me very well." "Don't you remember me, Rory?" "Yes, madam," said I, "for my own part, I shall never forget you. Sir, this is one of the young ladies, who, as I have formerly told you, treated me so humanely in my childhood." When I pronounced these words, my father's resentment glowed in his visage, and he ordered her to be gone, with such a commanding aspect, that she retired in a fright, muttering curses as she went downstairs. We afterwards learned that she was married to an ensign, who had already spent all her fortune, and that her sister had borne a child to her mother's footman, who is now her husband, and keeps a petty alehouse in the country. The fame of our flourishing condition having arrived at this place before us, we got notice that the magistrates intended next day to compliment us with the freedom of their town, upon which my father, considering their complaisance in the right point of view, ordered the horses to the coach early in the morning. We proceeded to our estate, which lay about 20 miles from this place, and, when we came within half a league of the house, were met by a prodigious number of poor tenants, men, women, and children, who testified their joy by loud acclamations, and accompanied our coach to the gate. As there is no part of the world in which the peasants are more attached to their lords than in Scotland, we were almost devoured by their affections. My father had always been their favourite, and now that he appeared their master, after having been thought dead so long, their joy broke out into 1,000 extravagances. When we entered the courtyard, we were surrounded by a vast number, who crowded together so closely to see us that several were in danger of being squeezed to death. Those who were near Don Rodrigo fell upon their knees, and kissed his hand, or the hem of his garment, praying aloud for long life and prosperity to him. Others approached Narcissa and me in the same manner, while the rest clapped their hands at a distance, and invoked heaven to shower its choicest blessings on our heads. In short, the whole scene, though rude, was so affecting, that the gentle partner of my heart wept over it, and my father himself could not refrain from dropping a tear. Having welcomed his daughter and me to his house, he ordered some bullocks to be killed, and some hogsheads of ale to be brought from the neighboring village, to regale these honest people, who had not enjoyed such a holiday for many years before. Next day we were visited by the gentlemen in the neighborhood, most of them our relations, one of whom brought along my cousin, the fox hunter, who had stayed at his house since he was obliged to leave his own. My father was generous enough to receive him kindly, and even promised to purchase for him a commission in the army, for which he expressed great thankfulness and joy. My charming Narcissa was universally admired and loved for her beauty, affability, and good sense, and so well pleased with the situation of the place, and the company round, that she has not as yet discovered the least desire of changing her habitation. We had not been many days settled, when I prevailed upon my father to pay a visit to the village where I had been at school. Here we were received by the principal inhabitants, who entertained us in the church, where Mr. Syntax the schoolmaster, my tyrant being dead, pronounced a Latin oration in honor of our family. And none exerted themselves more than Strap's father and relations, who looked upon the honest valet as the first gentleman of their race, and honored his benefactors accordingly. Having received the homage of this place, we retired, leaving £40 for the benefit of the poor of the parish, and that very night, Strap being a little elevated with the regard that had been shown to him, and to me on his account, ventured to tell me, that he had a sneaking kindness for Miss Williams, and that, if his lady and I would use our interest in his behalf, he did not doubt that she would listen to his addresses. Surprised at this proposal, I asked if he knew the story of that unfortunate young gentlewoman, upon which he replied, "Yes, yes, I know what you mean. She has been unhappy, I grant you, but what of that? I am convinced of her reformation, or else you and my good lady would not treat her with such respect. As for the censure of the world, I value it not a fig's end, besides, the world knows nothing of the matter." I commended his philosophy, and interested Narcissa in his cause, who interceded so effectually, that in a little time Miss Williams yielded her consent, and they were married at the approbation of Don Rodrigo, who gave him £500 to stock a farm, and made him overseer of his estate. My generous bedfellow gave her maid the same sum, so that they live in great peace and plenty within half a mile of us, and daily put up prayers for our preservation. If there be such a thing as true happiness on earth, I enjoy it. The impetuous transports of my passion are now settled and mellowed into endearing fondness and tranquillity of love, rooted by that intimate connection and interchange of hearts which naught but virtuous wedlock can produce. Fortune seems determined to make ample amends for her former cruelty, for my proctor writes that, notwithstanding the clause in my father-in-law's will, on which the squire founds his claim, I shall certainly recover my wife's fortune, in consequence of a codicil annexed, which explains that clause, and limits her restriction to the age of 19, after which she was at her own disposal. I would have set out for London immediately after receiving this piece of intelligence, but my dear angel has been qualmish of late, and begins to grow remarkably round in the waist, so that I cannot leave her in such an interesting situation, which I hope will produce something to crown my felicity.